morning. So next up, we have Jonathan Zinman, who's a professor at Dartmouth College. He'll be presenting on bad luck or bad decisions, macroeconomic implications of persistent heterogeneity in cognitive skills and overconfidence. Just trying to get out of the full screen, I think, over here. Try and see. All right. You should be good with your clicker here as well. Oh, and just so everybody knows, the restrooms, if you follow the signs over there, you can follow the corner and there'll be signs out to the restrooms in the other room over there.
Great, thanks. Am I close enough to the mic? So this is joint work with two brilliant young macroeconomists. I am neither young nor a macroeconomist. Begging the question, perhaps from looking at the paper title.
Do you want the mobile? There's a mobile one too if you want one. Like a microphone. You want to use the mobile microphone.
I want to be able to advance the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right. Okay, so begging the question of why am I here? What am I doing on this paper? This is my initial foray into macro, and what am I doing here with a macro paper at a conference on the psychology of poverty? I know most of your work, like my previous work, has tended to be quite micro. Well, I'm here because the foundation of what we're doing macro-wise in this paper and in this larger project is very micro. All right, so what we are trying to do is take some empirically grounded, very micro heterogeneity in people's decision-making, financial decision-making, to help macroeconomists improve their modeling of the aggregate economy and in particular macro fluctuations. And so what we're doing in broad strokes in this paper is adding a bit of micro-behavioral heterogeneity that opens up the possibility of people making systematically bad, maybe I hesitate to use the word bad, but it is in the title after all, to what macroeconomists typically do, which is basically only account for bad luck. Okay, and so, and the goal, of course, is to build better macro models that allow us to better fit the data and then use those models to better understand how to improve policy, how to help people and stabilize the macroeconomy. Okay, so that's what we are trying to do in this paper and this project. And so the more specific starting point in this paper is there has been this increasingly recognition over the last 10 to 15 years or so that heterogeneity in household and we often say consumer savings behavior and financial situations matters a lot for the macroeconomy and fluctuations in the macroeconomy and how we try to stabilize and stimulate the macroeconomy. But so far, there's been, as I just previewed, relatively little work trying to account for more systematic and persistent differences in household decision making. Right. And so when we started thinking about this based in part on some prior work that I've been doing with Victor Stango on how cognitive skills are linked to various behavioral biases that behavioral economists have been studying for years now, cognitive skills at first to us seem like a very likely place to start for macro purposes, because this is actually something that macro and sort of macro curious folks have been working on and linking to differences across countries in economic growth. Some very exciting new work by DeCunto and co-authors linking cognitive skills to inflation expectations and whatnot, and also to differences across household in income. Okay, and so sort of a starting point, one way to think about a starting point for this paper is building on that work with a focus on aggregate fluctuations and stabilization, and looking at whether cognitive skill heterogeneity can explain differences in micro savings behavior and the macro stuff that the macro folks care about. Okay, and so what we do here is start with microdata, all from the US in this paper, to develop several new facts about how cognitive skills, beliefs, and in particular, so the key thing is going to be beliefs about one's own skills and household financial situations are related. Then we're going to take these facts to do what the modelers call discipline the model. All right, so we're going to build a very sort of micro data shaped and guided model where we add cognitive skills heterogeneity to an otherwise sort of state-of-the-art bells and whistles quantitative macro model. It's going to turn out that cognitive skills heterogeneity alone isn't going to be enough, and the key innovation that we have in this paper is accounting for heterogeneity in beliefs about one's own skills, and in particular about the non-trivial proportion of people, both in our data and other data, who seem to be persistently overconfident about their own skills, and consequently things like their own productivity out in the labor market. All right, and so we're gonna use this to help explain what's been quite a puzzle in both macro and, for that matter, micro, which is the prevalence of people being persistently financially constrained. Macro folks refer to this as hand-to-mouth consumers or households. In development, we tend to think more about financial constraints, liquidity constraints, and increasingly the financial stress that arises from that. But it's all, for what we're doing, those things are all synonymous. And as I said, we're going to use this to better fit macro data. Okay, and so just to preview what we find here is in the micro data, we find very systematic and strong relationships between cognitive skills and savings behavior that I don't want to say mediated, because we're not doing mediation analysis in this paper, but it is the overall pattern here is quite consistent with overconfident about cognitive skills, particularly among those who are relatively low skilled, playing a really important role. And we know both in our data and from prior work that cognitively less skilled households are perhaps more prone, they are in our data far more prone to overestimate their own skills. So we document that again in the data in this paper. We among the new stuff, the new micro findings, is that we show that overconfident households are also more likely to be persistently overly optimistic about their future financial situations. They make persistently overly optimistic forecast errors, and they're also far more likely to be persistently, again, hand-to-mouth, financially constrained, however you want to label it, And in particular, of particular importance for macro, they tend to have persistently little, if any, precautionary savings. Okay. I'm going to show you, hopefully, if I have time, that overconfidence about one's own skills is common in our data. It's even more common in this fascinating recent American Economic Review paper by Huffman and co-authors, where managers are competing in this repeated high stakes workplace tournament, so like real world setting. And they have this very compelling evidence that almost half of these managers are persistently overconfident about their performance in ways that end up adversely affecting their compensation. Okay, so if anything, we may be, in our data here, we may be being a bit conservative in our estimates of sort of how overconfident and how many overconfident people there are out there in our macro economy. All right, and so this is overconfidence is the key piece here, because as I'll show you, hopefully if I have time empirically, but theoretically, if all you add in the model, if all you have is cognitive skills heterogeneity, so some people are more productive than others, this does not solve the problems that plague these macro models, nor does it provide a potential answer at the micro level to why we tend to see so many people persistently be at financial constraints and under financial distress, because even low skilled poor folks in basically any standard classical model will eventually save themselves out of trouble. Okay, and so the overconfidence here ends up being key, because it provides an explanation for why people end up persistently constrained and persistently distressed. This should be in bold. The key mechanism is that when you're overconfident, when you think that things are going to improve for you in the future, here it's your financial situation, you undervalue insurance and self-insurance. And so think about consumption insurance and consumption smoothing, right? So you think things are going to improve, you're more inclined to spend and keep spending and less inclined to precautionary save. And so you're way more likely to just persistently end up in a financial situation where you are hand to mouth, where you are at some sort of financial constraint. All right, and this is, hopefully I'll have time to talk a bit about how and why this matters for policy. Should check. So we, one thing I love about this paper is we are certainly intersecting with and hopefully contributing with to various previously largely unconnected literatures in both micro and macro. Two that I want to highlight in particular by way of explanation for why I think I'm here today is we think that there are potentially important connections with and complementarities with a couple of literatures that are perhaps more squarely and evidently in the sort of psychology of poverty space, namely aspirations and financial stress. And so the aspirations literature has overall has taken a very different approach to what we're doing here. They tend to be focused more on lack of aspirations and perhaps over pessimism. They tend to be more interested in growth. Here we're focused on stabilization. Where they tend to be focused more on preferences and problem solving. Here we're focused on beliefs, right? And so in that sense, I think there's some strong complementarity, and we're taking very different approaches in terms of frameworks and setups to trying to answer some of the same questions, although again, that literature has been more focused on growth than on stabilization. We're not doing anything on growth yet. There's also this literature that some of you, it sounds like, may have gotten a flavor of maybe last year. Berkeley here has a wonderful behavioral macro group, and two of those folks are on the one paper I know of that tries to very explicitly build a bridge from work on scarcity and financial stress to macro. I think literally our work may be a strong complement to this work, in the sense that, like, when you start to think about what we're finding and how people end up at constraints, and you combine that with what this literature is finding, which is that being at constraints, particularly persistently, can have sort of downward spiral effects of creating more stress. So there's a lot of overlap, but also a lot of key differences from what Chen and Yuri and Sergeyev are doing in the paper that some of you may have seen last year. Overall, we think we're the first paper to show these empirical links between heterogeneity, not just in cognitive skills, but also overconfidence and important heterogeneity in household financial situations and constraints and distress. We think we're the first paper to show that, that adding this to an otherwise standard state-of-the-art macro model improves the model's performance, as I'm about to show you, and then to explore policy implications as sort of a use case for what we think one can do, policymakers can do, other researchers can do with our hopefully new and improved modeling machinery. Okay, so let me show you a bit more about our results and tell you a bit more about our data. So the micro data here starts with this data that Victor Stengo and I collected and have analyzed in two papers, actually a ReStud paper and another paper we just revised for AJ Micro. Panelists basically complete many versions of standard stylized tasks that are designed to measure various different, but as Stengo and I show, quite strongly empirically related behavioral biases and cognitive skills. All right, and then we also connect this data, merge this data with other data on our same folks, on our same panelists. And this is all from the American Life Panel. All right, I'll zoom through this, but I put this up just to basically hopefully give some assurance that we're measuring our key objects in relatively standard ways, both with respect to cognitive skills and to overconfidence. Shout out Don Moore. I think most of what I have tried to learn about conceptualizing and measuring overconfidence comes from Don's work. New to this paper, but present in other fascinating work, is measuring forecast errors in financial situations. So the object here are standard questions used to help measure consumer sentiment all over the world. And so these are basically just questions that ask, like, how do you think your household's going to be doing overall financially 12 months from now? And when you have a panel, you can come back and ask people how they actually end up doing. And so what we find is that forecast errors are far more likely to be optimistic than pessimistic. They're quite persistent, and there's only sort of modest learning during our sample time frame. We also have various ways of measuring financial constraints of sort of different varieties and varying severity. Okay, and so what we find is very strong negative correlations between cognitive skills and our financial constraint measures. We find that overconfident households are more likely to be persistently overly optimistic about their future financial situation compared to their sort of better calibrated, more classically rational looking counterparts. And we find that our measures of overconfidence are also quite strongly positively correlated with being financially constrained. So more overconfidence, more likely to face persistent financial constraints and have little, if any, precautionary saving. Okay, we certainly have considered, sort of given the default preference in economics for classical rationality, we certainly have considered going down that road. Others have as well. I think the uncomfortable facts for people who are more wedded to classical rationality than we are is that it doesn't fit the data as well, either theoretically or empirically. And we go into this in some detail in the paper. Okay. So our model stripped of technicalities in one slide. We basically start with a sort of state-of-the-art quantitative setup. The only heterogeneity in this standard setup, as I foreshadowed, is in bad luck, is in sort of what kind of shocks you each consumer in the model happens to get. So we've got that heterogeneity. We've got the possibility of bad luck. We've got all the standard machinery that macroeconomists use and need to analyze dynamics and equilibria. And then we add this, it ends up being only one piece of behavioral heterogeneity. So we use our data to guide us towards including a share, an empirically grounded share of households who are overconfident. These overconfident households, for modeling simplicity, are also low skill. So we have two types of consumers in our basic model, and we can get fancier, and we do, but we show it doesn't, being richer actually doesn't add anything. So we've got overconfident and low skilled households, and classically rational and high skilled households. And again, this is all how we parameterize this is all guided by our microdata. And then we assess model performance based on its ability to match, as I foreshadowed at the outset, both the microdata on the persistence, the shares of people who are persistently at financial constraints or financially distressed, aka hand to mouth, and also the sort of key statistics that macroeconomists are focused on. Okay, and that's what this slide is about. This slide is basically showing that our model in column 1 can fit, so that first row, hand to mouth share, is from microdata. The average MPC is just an aggregate macro statistic. We're fitting the data better than standard models can, and the last column shows that it's overconfidence that's really driving things. We also, our model can also do a better job of fitting the wealth distribution. And I want to use what little time I have remaining to talk about policy implications. So there's a lot in the paper. I think the policy implications can be distilled to two things, or sort of two mechanisms. One pertains to anything that involves targeting. Okay, so in our setup, it actually, a bit frustratingly, becomes more difficult for many applications to target the folks we'd like to target based just on income. Why is that? Because we end up with a fair amount of high income folks who we might want to help because they're persistently financially constrained, because they're overconfident. And conversely, there are many lower income folks who are financially constrained, not just because they're unlucky, but because they're overconfident. So in a nutshell, targeting based on income becomes less effective in our setup. This figure is basically showing you that we do a better job of matching the data on how many people are financially constrained at sort of each throughout the income distribution. Another implication hinges on, I'll just summarize. Another implication sort of hinges on the fact that our overconfident consumers undervalue insurance, right? So it is both, so it is harder to induce them to self-insure, but at the same time, also less distortionary when you do insure them through, say, some kind of social insurance like a minimum income benefit. So typically in a standard classically rational model, one of the big potential critiques of sort of basic minimum income floors is that, well, this is going to be very distortionary. It's going to crowd out a lot of people's own precautionary savings or other sort of precautionary insurance taking measures. In our model, you need to worry much less about that because it's really hard to get overconfident people to precautionary save in the first place, or even respond to new incentives to insure or disinsure. So there's sort of a good news, bad news flavor to the policy analysis in our paper. So just to recap and sum up, we've got this new evidence-based linkage between persistent overconfidence about household financial condition and persistent financial constraints and distress and trouble. We find that accounting for this in a stylized way in an otherwise state-of-the-art macro model improves the ability of the model to fit both key elements of micro and macro data, and potentially changes how we think about various types of fiscal policy, stabilization policy, social insurance policy. And we think and hope that our work strongly complements and eventually will intersect and to some extent merge with work on aspirations and financial stress and its potentially deleterious effects on cognition. Thanks.
We'll have a little bit of time for questions just for Jonathan, and then we'll do a group discussion with the speakers up at the top here.
Fascinating work. Can you remind us of your measures of overconfidence? It looked like you were focused on overplacement, the degree to which people thought they placed higher in the income distribution than they did, but then you talked a lot about overestimation, the degree to which they overestimated how much money they'd have in the future. And if you can remind us of the correlations between those measures and measures of cognitive skills and financial constraint. Great.
So okay. Just a reminder to introduce yourself and then for you to say the question.
One more.
You can, yeah.
I got the shout out earlier.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Don Moore. So, all right, so let me try to start at the beginning of your question. The measure of overconfidence that we use in this paper is based on overplacement. So people take a version of a standard fluid intelligence test, the number series. We ask them ahead of time how they think they're going to rank relative to everyone else in this sample that we described for them. So that's what we use. The Stango-Zinman data also measures overconfidence in absolute performance, and we also have a very coarse measure of overconfidence in precision. In in one of the Stango-Zinman papers and also in some other work by Eric Snowberg and Colin Kammerer and co-authors, we all show that, these, as you have found, that these different varieties of overconfidence are pretty strongly correlated within person, right? So if you're overconfident in one way, you're more likely to be overconfident another way. Okay, so I think that was your first question. Your second question would be, what's the correlation between our measure of overconfidence and cognitive skills? It is incredibly strong, and we have an appendix table on that in the paper, and it's also featured in one of the Stango-Zinman papers. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. You also asked about sort of the sort of measurement mapping from overconfidence to what we can observe about forecast errors about future financial situation. So the future, yeah, so you're right, the future financial situation forecast errors are a level thing. They're not about placement. They're just asking about how do you think you and your family are going to be doing? And so presumably that's more of sort of like a level absolute thing, not a relative thing. Am I missing anything? Did you have anything?
I was wondering if you could tell us which correlates more strongly with actual financial constraint, the cognitive skills or the overconfidence measures?
Oh, good question. And that's all in the paper. I don't think I have it in the slides. They're both very strongly correlated. If I remember correctly, we might be seeing somewhat stronger, even more negative correlations with cognitive skills. I wouldn't put too much stock in the magnitudes and comparing the magnitudes, in the sense that I think it is absolutely fair to say that our measures of cognitive skills are better, sort of more granular, less laden with measurement error than our measures of overconfidence for sort of research design reasons and constraints that are completely on Stango and Zinman that I now have some regrets about, but definitely I definitely think one of the directions to push work sort of using our thing is in getting sort of do what we're doing with better, more granular, more tighter conceptually linked measures of overconfidence. Because what we're using is pretty quick and dirty, actually.
One more question.
Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, one more question for Jonathan, then we'll be in the panel so we can have all the discussion.
Thank you. So this is Travis Libert from UC Davis. Great stuff. I had more of a conceptual question, but it picks up on, you seem to kind of pause and make this distinction between beliefs and preferences, and in the paper you said there's a distinction. It seems like in this kind of a model that the emergence and persistence of overconfidence, though, I mean, it seems like that may not be as sharp a distinction as you might take. I mean, in one sense, it could be time preferences and present biasness or endogenously truncated planning horizons or something that make overconfidence persist. That is, like, there's this anticipatory utility of overconfidence that then doesn't have, there's no breaks if you don't sort of have preferences that extend far enough into the future. So I'm just curious if you can say a little bit more about why is that distinction important to you, the distinction between beliefs and preferences, and maybe just reflect on this kind of conceptual idea of anticipatory utility maybe being what is driving overconfidence.
Yeah. So why is it a potentially important distinction? I think it's in large part practical, in the sense that people who, in my experience at least, people who do modeling for a living, and doing macro modeling for a living is not a technically easy thing to do. And people who try to use macro models to solve real world problems want the absolute minimum number of moving parts necessary to do a good job of fitting the data better and helping us understand the world better. And so the sort of types of interactions and sort of intrapersonal dynamics that you're talking about add a fair amount of complexity. Having said that, we do nod to anticipatory utility in our conclusion as something to explore in future work, in the sense that, like, I mean, those of us who study overconfidence and consume work on overconfidence know that it's not necessarily all bad all the time, right? And so the work on anticipatory utility is but sort of one strand that tries to take that into account. What I would say, and I don't want to sort of like lose the main thread and main message here, is that, like, my prior is that, if anything, we're probably underestimating how bad it can be, in the sense that if the folks working on financial stress and scarcity are right, you have this connection between overconfidence and being persistently at some constraint or in financial distress, that potentially has downward spiral, sort of perpetuating effect. So, like, to me, that's where I'm most interested in pushing, but it is absolutely fair to acknowledge that overconfidence is not always all bad, and hopefully, if not us, others can sort of take up that part of the mantle.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan.